Recording will start now. Just repeating, the topic is that it is in the electoral interest of the National Republican Party to strongly oppose Donald Trump's primaries campaign. Let's get started. First affirmative speaker, Neri. Here.
All right. Hi, am I audible now? Yep. Okay. Perfect.
Did they say yes? I think we might be
okay. Are we lagging? Because it says our internet connection is stable.
Yeah,
unstable rather.
Your
okay?
visual,
Okay,
your
great.
visual,
Okay.
your.
Okay. Speech starting in 3, 2, 1. From the get-go, we will concede Trump is probably and is indeed the current leading Republican president-elect and has support. That's in terms of popularity amongst those voters. And he also has decent support from prominent Republicans. But it's important to note that this debate is about electoral interests. So what are electoral interests? It's simply to win the most strategic seats in government to get as much power as possible. So it is not purely based on being able to win president, but about the overall strategy to galvanize power for the party. We would say in that end, it is equally as important, or there's also a priority to win seats in the House. So what is the burden then coming from us? If we prove any of these win conditions, we win the debate because they independently fill the electoral interests of the GOP. First, that we can win the primaries against Trump, or that we can win the House and Senate or executive against Democrats. So again, these are one of if we prove any of these 1-2 win conditions, we already win this debate because it fulfills electoral interests. What then is the model coming from our side? 2 things. Number 1, we would say that we would probably prefer someone like Ted Cruz or Mike Pence, typical GOP, typical conservative, probably and honestly a lot less volatile, a lot more reliable actors overall as compared to Trump. But secondly, let's ask the question then, what does strongly opposing look like? So we cannot stop Trump from running in the primaries, but the GOP will not endorse it. So they will basically mudsling whatever they can, call him out, bring out all the dirt from his time in office, use moral ascendancy, such as saying he no longer embodies the principles of the party, such as religiosity, which in fact a lot of Republicans already use against him. So 3 things coming from us. 1, why we can make him lose. 2, why winning him winning like hurts more important electoral interests, and why we are more likely to win key seats for the GOP. And 3, ultimately, why he is just not as valuable overall. Let's go then to the first thing. All preemptions are going to be integrated. Why we can make him lose. It's important to understand the context and the frame from which his power comes from. In 2016, his win only resulted from a perfect storm of bad luck for the Democrats, and it was still quite close. First of all, he had overwhelming support from virtually all Republicans in the primary. It wasn't even close. So GOP supporters only rallied behind him because they had no other alternative. This means that traditional GOP supporters in Republican states, such as Texas, are unlikely to vote for him, given a more popular candidate like Ted Cruz, who is from Texas. The second part of the perfect storm was the Russian intervention, leaking Hillary's emails in Benghazi. But third, that Hillary was also a particularly unfortunate vulnerable candidate, right, in the election, such as the fact that she's a woman going against a straight male, but also that Hillary also had a political track record already for Trump to mock, right? So Trump at that point had never been in politics, and so there was nothing to call out or mock. But the fourth thing in the storm was Cambridge Analytica selling data to voters so that Trump could exploit their fears, using hateful rhetoric to make him seem like the savior, which we now know he is not. With all of that help, Trump still lost a popular vote and only won on electorates. So this is the frame that's important to note in understanding where he got his power from. So why will the GOP's opposition be effective then? Number 1, the lots of mysticism surrounding him is gone, because we have now seen how he is in politics. You can no longer make decisions purely based on these speculative things of how he would probably be in office. But secondly, that most of his campaign points failed. He did not make good on his promises about the wall. It became a pathetic iron fence that just wasted money. His xenophobic policies did not do anything as well. We would say, like the Muslim ban that he said that he wanted, for example, ended up not like really coming into like strong fruition. So he ended up not really fulfilling the promises he made to the people who supported them. But the first level then is like you would say that the party allegiance is strong, and that's how the GOP's opposition will be effective. Because in a very polarized bipartisan country like the United States, voters don't care that much, right? Since Trump mostly won in 2016 because the Republicans endorsed him and because of a lot of that mysticism that has gone away. But secondly, that it is as early as the primaries, that there's more time to invest in other candidates at this point in time, or for other candidates to gain prominence, because there's still 2 more years left, right? And that means that Pence and his campaign, on just being a good Christian, probably has a lot more time to like get a lot more support, right? But third, that he's losing out on the voter base that have historically supported the GOP. But fourth, that a lot of the hardcore Trump supporters won't align with him now for 2 reasons. One, because he doesn't have the perfect storm he had in 2016 with Cambridge Analytica, etc. So they are regulating like data privacy as we speak, and like there's a lot of other things that are trying to balance out the things that help Trump win. But secondly, that a lot of these non-hardcore like supporters are disillusioned. Voters are turned off from Trump's COVID response, right? Republicans hated him for it because they were left behind. And like again, and Biden was not the best at handling COVID, but Trump was way worse. Things like delayed response, things like vaccine holdup, right? The most visceral harms like death at the height of the pandemic happened under his administration. The impact here is simple. Trump is unlikely to gain a substantial voter base because even traditional Republican supporters know that he is an unreasonable actor in times of crisis. But the second reason why GOP opposition is likely to be effective is because GOP has dirt on him from his time in office, and they can use it to make him lose. Know that was something that did not exist in 2016, but that is something that exists now. They can talk about his anti-democratic call to storm Capitol Hill, which is heavily against even conservatives, right? And this is why Mike Pence could not stand with Trump, and many other Republican politicians also commented in disgust for this, right? But there can be more exposés on Trump's horrible and dangerous conduct behind closed doors, right? In the past, we had the CIA guy who resigned and wrote that book. You have, like, again, he's instigating aggressive foreign policy towards volatile actors in the Middle East. These are things that have been exposed and can continue to be exposed that will put more dirt on him. But third, that elections are a marathon and not a sprint. We concede that in the worst case, our opposition might not make him lose the primary, but it can make him lose the election in the long run. Even if we don't convince Republican voters right now, the seed of doubt is planted in their head, and they are likely going to scrutinize his presidential race very heavily when he is inevitably going to say something crazy, says even more immoral language against women, or denounces another key international ally, or promises to waste money on another random xenophobic campaign. Republican voters will come to their senses and vote Biden or not even show up to the ballot box. But why would we prefer, like, I think the next question, the second thing we want to discuss then is why him winning hurts more important electoral interests, and why we are likely to win more key seats for the GOP. The priority is like probably winning the House as well. So number one, we are likely to win the House because the entire GOP will be scrutinized if Trump runs as the presidential candidate, right? Because again, it's easy for Democratic candidates to say, don't vote for the GOP Congress, or like Congress members or governor because of Trump. That the GOP candidate may not support or like Trump, but members will not vote for him because of the impression that a vote for a GOP candidate is also supporting Trump. But therefore, other innocent GOP candidates are less likely to win, and therefore gain less leverage and power to control the legislative branch. But we would say that, like, why that, like, asking the question then, why winning Congress and the House is more important? Because winning the House provides you a lot of the leverage. Having a majority in Congress is the only way to get policies done. They give you the ability to launch investigations into presidential executive acts, like how they investigated Obama in 2011 for Benghazi. And they can do the same for Biden and further damage credibility, right? But this is important because they make sure you have a strong House that allows you to keep in check the Democrats, even if Biden wins a second term. So this argument proves that supporting Trump at all stages is bad, but more importantly, that whether it be securing seats in the House or securing the president-elect, it is far better on our side without Trump in the picture.
Thanks, Prime Minister, for that wonderful speech. And now welcome the Leader of the Opposition to begin the case for side negative, Sydney 4. It's Alex, their pronouns are they. Here.
Just confirming that I'm audible. Great, thank you. The first thing that I want to note at the very beginning of the debate is that of the myriad of factors which win and lose parties' debates, it is very rarely the actual individual that is going for that position to begin with. That is the most substantial factor, right? That's for a series of reasons. Firstly, things like you have an incredibly ingrained voter base. You have people who will always vote Republican or always will vote Democrat, regardless of who the individual candidate is. Secondly, because many factors are symmetric between candidates, right? You run on similar policy sets and platforms. You run this, your advertising campaigns are managed by the same individuals. The types of media companies that you appeal to and that construct the narratives surrounding your campaigns are still run by the same people with the same interests, regardless of who the individual candidate is. What that means then, and at the end of this, is that the individual who is in this position for presidential candidate is less likely to be important, but what is likely to be substantially important is the path we take to get there. It is how the Republican Party goes about conducting their primaries. And that means that even if we were willing to back Trump or DeSantis individually or any individual Republican candidate, we tell you that it will always be worse for the Republican Party overall if they do this by directly knifing one of their most forerunning candidates, by giving an appearance of a massively split party, by sabotaging one of their own campaigns. So three things in this speech. First off, on why Trump actually was likely to be an incredibly viable candidate. Secondly, on how it damaged the national campaign. Thirdly, on the backlash you were likely to see from Trump. So what did they tell us here that Trump is already somewhat unlikely to be viable, that he only won the 2016 election, that it was this whole perfect storm. I think the first thing to tell you here is to look at the 2020 election, right? Because everything they tell you about campaign promises or everything they tell you about the 2016 circumstantial factors just falls down at the second that you examine the actual results of the 2020 election, and you understand that the 2020 election still was incredibly close despite all the factors they point to. He still had an incredibly entrenched voter base. He still had actually a variety of new voters voting for him in 2020 for the first time. And that should tell you that none of their analysis here to suggest he'll be unsuccessful actually stands. Why then do we think that he actually is uniquely likely to be successful? And first thing to note here is that Republican is that he just comparatively, as is conceded by the affirmative, has an incredibly entrenched voter base. He does appeal to people massively. And in particular, he appeals to a major group of people who think that the election was stolen for them. Secondly, he has substantially easier ability to play the game in a way that is advantageous to him, right? He is incredibly charismatic compared to other types of candidates. He has massive access to platforms such as Fox News, which allow him to rally his voter base. And he is particularly strong on the issues that are particularly integral to the Republican Party's platform right now, which looks like things like on other culture wars, which looked like taking a stance on things like critical race theory. These were the things that were particularly important for mobilizing the Republican voter base in the modern day. And these were all issues which he was most strong on. For all of these reasons, we suggested that Trump was just going to be a viable candidate to begin with. Secondly, then, on how this actually is a weaken and the national campaign. I think the first thing to note here is that it was actually somewhat unlikely to affect the result of the primaries themselves to the extent that the affirmative team wanted to complain. And this was for the very reason that the types of Republican voters who vote in the primaries to begin with already have incredibly entrenched views, right? They are already the most switched on Republican voters. They're the ones that were willing to vote in two elections, and that the divisions between respective Republican candidates in this sense at the stage of the primaries were already particularly clear, right? You just had people who supported the establishment versus people who didn't. This wasn't something you could simply campaign your way out of. You could not convert someone into a candidate that simply did not represent them, was not what they stand for. And therefore it was substantially unlikely that you were going to actually alter the result of the primary in a way that was particularly meaningful. And therefore, if you believe, therefore they already lose there. But then secondly there, what did you sacrifice in terms of an opportunity cost when you did direct all of your funding, directed all of your campaigning towards trying to alter the outcome of a primary where you're already going to be unsuccessful? And the first thing to note here The Republicans who vote for you in a primary were already going to be the ones who vote for you in the election regardless, right? They are the most entrenched. They are the most politically engaged. And therefore, this was a particularly pernicious waste of resources, right? You are targeting towards the group that was already going to be voting for you, when you could instead be doing things like targeting moderate voters, getting more voter mobilization, getting the people who otherwise weren't going to vote for you in the national election or in any other comparable election. These were the types of people that it was actually meaningful to target your resources there. If you believe that advertising and campaigning are effective, you should believe that we should be targeting towards them the groups that actually have the ability to sway electoral outcomes. Thirdly, then, it just made your party look bad in a way that was going to be detrimental to the result, right? First thing to note here is that this is an incredibly abnormal stance for any party within the US to take, right? You simply do not do things like disavow an entire primary candidate. And that is for the very reason that when you always want to have the ability to put your full force behind that candidate if they are to win, right? You don't want to be in the situation where you have spent like millions of dollars on hate ads against Trump, and then he wins the primary and you've made yourself look horrific, right? This is something, and this is completely unprecedented. And therefore, this type of strategy by the Republican Party was something that the media was particularly likely to latch onto. It was likely to draw massive amounts of attention to infighting. It was likely to make your party look particularly weak. That was never going to be good for you. Secondly, then, on if Trump were to still win the primary, which we tell you is particularly likely. I think the first thing to note here, you probably still do damage his reputation in a broader sense, and Democrats are probably likely to co-opt the type of advertising that you've used to co-opt this messaging. And this is particularly important because you harm the people who did not vote in primaries. But thirdly, then, even if you had the other candidate win, whether that be DeSantis, whether that be Pence, it means that you now give that during the primary process, you give Trump a massive incentive and a massive justification for running his own retaliatory campaigns, which were likely to be particularly bad, right? At the point where fire against your own party is permissible, that is absolutely something that Trump was going to engage with, and it was absolutely something that was equally going to be weaponized if that candidate were to win later on. For all these reasons, and all candidates, regardless of who win, was going to be disproportionately damaged if you ran this kind of strategy. Thirdly, then, you just simply made the party just look substantially more chaotic. A party that could not appear to govern itself to the extent of being able to being able to get behind its own candidates just looked worse. And that was particularly important because Republicans run on this kind of authoritarian platform. They run on being able to appear strong relative to Democratic candidates. At the point where you were infighting, it made you look weak. And this was particularly important because primaries were already a place where you got some degree of infighting. It was already something that you kind of wanted to cover up to draw less media attention towards, which was why post the primaries, things were particularly important, like getting endorsement from other primary candidates to be able to present this degree of unity. Any additional focus on the primaries themselves took away from your ability to do things like draw more attention to your policy campaign, uniting your own party further on. All of these things made worsened your party's chances. All of these things knifed whichever candidate won, regardless, got through the primary regardless. For all these reasons, so proud to negate.
Thank you to the Leader of the Opposition for their speech, and now welcome the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case for Ateneo 2. It's Rivaldo Aquino. Here.
I'll use my... Hello, am I audible? All right, perfect. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to do 3 things in this speech to win the debate this early. Firstly, I'll address the issue of a split party. Secondly, I'll talk about who we want as president, why we can have a better president than Trump, because we don't need him to win. But lastly, I'll remind you of the importance of winning the House, which we weigh as the most important value in this debate, which is tanked and completely destroyed by Trump's presidency. Let's address the issue of a split party, because their arguments might seem persuasive in a vacuum, but in reality, they're empirically just not true. The reality of the primary election is that there's always a division in politics, and like Americans are always used to this. Let's be honest, like party unity that occurs in the national election is completely absent in the primaries. Why? Because ultimately, different people have conceptions of what best embodies the ideals of the Democrat Party or the Republican Party. And that's why primary candidates rip each other to shreds for months on end, like Ben Carson going against Trump and calling him horrible, right? The Democrats are bigger examples of this, like Bernie Sanders calling all of them dirty capitalists and immoral, but then all of the other Democratic candidates calling Bernie crazy and radical. But this is par for the course, and unity is repaired in time for the national election. The fact of the matter is that once there is no choice and people have to pull out of the primary debate, they just concede that they can't win and they end up supporting someone else, which is the closest approximation of their values. Look at Vote Blue No Matter Who, in which after Bernie Sanders lost or pulled out of the primary election or ultimately lost it, he still ultimately said that, oh, it's important to, even though we couldn't get what we wanted, it's important that we vote for the person who still closely embodies the spirit of the Democratic Party. And so let's all channel our support towards the Democratic candidate. This is also true in terms of the use of resources. This is not really a big issue in this debate. They say you already spent so much money on capital, on advertising through the primaries. Again, this is par for the course. But also, we don't think money is out for the Republican Party. There's always a massive super PAC that backs the Republican Party and the candidates. Their money is basically infinite. They're the conservatives that run all the corporations, etc. And so that's not the most important issue in the debate. The important issue is not the split of the party. It's about who the party then chooses to endorse. Because they still haven't addressed a lot of the standing arguments, right? How party loyalty exists, right? There's a contradiction when they say that what usually matters ultimately is not the person that is winning the election. What matters is the actual policies that they carry out, or it's usually still the same people designing the policies. Firstly, we'd say that party loyalty exists to the extent that voters are more loyal to the ideas that they embody. That's why we told you that since Trump has massively gone against the issues of conservative religious morality, gone against the issues of respecting women, then obviously that parties will not think that you embody the idea which they support in the Republican Party. Also, the fact he has not been conservative in terms of economic policy at all. The fact that he's wasted so much money on useless things, like, for example, being more isolationist instead of maximizing global trade before the pandemic, which has screwed them up so badly now. The fact that they'd waste money on things like the wall, and even Republicans themselves hated the fact that Trump was like wasting all this money on things like this massive wall, and they had to make that awkward iron fence that did nothing but still wasted billions of dollars, right? The reality is that the party is tired of him, the voters are tired of him, and that's why if ever they're, with your own logic and characterization, then you cannot win this debate. What this proves then is that if what matters so much is the party ideals and the policies, then we can have a better president than Trump. Even if you say that there are all of these unique selling points about Trump, then why do we need that to win the election, right? We told you that we can have Pence and Santorum, and these people will likely win the election. Why? Because all they need to do is unite against the fact that they will be better than Biden. Told you what the meta of what the meta of US politics and presidency races has been. It's just to complain about the current president as much as possible. Since Biden's approval rating is already so low and his COVID response has been so bad, we can just use that as the uniting factor to vote red no matter who, just like how the Blues did it before. The only way that we threaten this viability is if we take the risk on Trump, an extremely strong man. Why? Because firstly, a lot of the mythicism as him, the strong man, has gone away, right? They have said that, oh, he still has this strong racial narrative. And instead of rebutting our structural reasons, they talk about how, no, they empirically, he still won more seats in the election, the 2020 election. Firstly, that racial narrative is not that strong, right? Look at the current political climate and how it no longer applies. Black Lives Matter, Stop Asian Hate, and police reform, conceding that there has been so much racism. Calling out and exposing that Trump was significantly inactive and denying of these kinds of issues systemically within the police system that have threatened public order, right? Even if people might be racist, Republicans might be racist in the worst case, they hate the level of destabilization that has happened because of Trump, and so they don't want to take the risk on him. But more importantly, if you need more structural reasons, it's simply a result of the political pendulum. The only reason that racism had merit in the past was because they had this long-standing economic issues which motivated rhetorics against immigrants, etc. But that was the problem at the time. But the problem right now is definitely more pressing in terms of hate crimes, the fact that the economy needs to be stimulated. And so there's support for things such as accommodating minorities, accommodating immigrants to make jobs, and prioritizing rebuilding like instead of discriminating against others, this racial narrative is not particularly strong. But even if you believe that that racist narrative is strong, we'd say that after the election, it doesn't matter that he got more votes in 2020, because one, he still lost, which means he lost more than he won. More importantly, he hurt his credibility more after the election. He kept tweeting bad stuff and got banned on all social media. And since all social media banned him, one, like that is a massive proof of consensus from everyone, authoritative like figures and powerful corporations, that they will not stand for Trump, and so a lot of people abandon him. But more importantly, Trump lost access to a lot of the dirty tactics he had to become viral in the past, right? The fact that he had data mining couldn't be done anymore, and the fact that he's not as viral anymore on his pathetic little website where he posts his videos but no one watches them anymore, right? The reality is that if he doesn't have many like strong selling points anymore, but more importantly, if he becomes the embodiment of the harms of Biden, right? If the fact that he was equally bad at his COVID response, and there are actually more visceral memories of more deaths, the peak of deaths was during his administration, then people will more likely actually vote Biden instead of him, because at least it wasn't quite as bad. More importantly, again, it would be worse than Pence, who did not rock the boat, who is probably pretty boring, but again, he's just a very conservative guy. He didn't support storming the Capitol, and so he can win just by being safe, right? This is the reality of politics nowadays. Presidents are a liability if they're as crazy as Trump, because one, they will not execute on the policies the GOP wants. Again, they won't follow his economic policy. He won't follow their international policy. He'll be radical and start assassinating people. More importantly, he will be a target, right? A target for attacks in which Democratic candidates will always be able to use, especially those running for seats in Congress, right? Like the House, both houses, right? The reality is that the House is a lot more important, because these are the people who are actually able to pass and create legislative bills that shape the state of and landscape of the nation, right? The reality is that both Trump and Biden had struggled during their administrations because of the fact that they were such punching bags that the opposition party was able to use to win majority seats in the House, right? We think that this race is much more important for two reasons. Firstly, because even if we have if we have a majority in the House, and we are the ones who create the legislative policies, we'd be able to force the president to at least allow these things or compromise on them. But more importantly, if we do have a democratic president, then we can also veto all of his policies. We can try to investigate him and destabilize him once we are in the House and legislative body. And for all of these reasons, we get the most power on affirmative.
Thanks, Deputy Prime Minister, for a wonderful speech. And now welcome the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to continue the case for Sydney 4. It's Sam. Let's pronounce it he, him, he, here.
Sorry, just give me a sec to sort out the paper.
Oh, the background is amazing. Sorry.
I'm glad you appreciate it. Okay, assuming I can be heard. Starting my speech in, oh, hang on, no, I've lost a piece of paper. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. First thing I'm going to deal with this in this speech is if they have any imperative in this debate at all. At first affirmative, they tell you that the GOP did not support him in 2016, but they also flag that Trump is currently the front runner in this election. The problem is that every piece of analysis of this affirmative team after that is in tension with it, because they tell you that the party is tired of Trump. They give you actually 4 mechanisms as to why the Republican Party already hates Trump. The problem with all their analysis is that this debate is about the margins, right? If you believe that Trump has already suffered backlash and the Republican Party hates him for not following through on conservative economic policy because they remember the way that people they knew died during his COVID response, you should probably also believe that he is simply going to lose the primary election, right? You should believe that there is no imperative to actually try and nuke his campaign because the other Republican frontrunners are going to do it for you and the GOP doesn't need to do it because the Democratic campaigners are going to spread the news because it is newsworthy about how terrible of a president Trump was, which means you simply do not need to do this. So all their analysis, right, and I'll go through all the mechanisms, mean there is no imperative. Firstly, they say that, well, you're now certain of Trump's failure, but this was already known. Secondly, they say the campaign promises failed, but this was already known. Thirdly, they say that, well, he doesn't align with Republican policy. But again, this would be known by Republicans in the status quo. The only marginal benefit that they get under their side is when they claim that you're now able to actively, you're actually able to support other candidates, but they never say why this kind of support would be particularly effective. In fact, we give you analysis as to why this kind of support wasn't going to achieve very much at all. Because we said that people were unlikely to switch their primary vote because there was a very clearly established dichotomy between establishment and anti-establishment, right? That's because given that they did not model who their front runner would be, it would probably be someone like Ron DeSantis. Look at the way that he is polling, look at the way in which his campaign is governed and support. That means that Ron DeSantis, the avowedly pro-establishment individual, is running against Trump, the avowedly anti-establishment individual. You can't convince someone to change how they think about whether the government should intervene on people's lives. That was probably going to be pretty stock standard. Sure, they were going to be able to convince a couple of people to switch, but it was going to be in the hundreds or thousands, and that was incredibly marginal impact in the debate. What did we say instead? We just said that we would use this time and political capital to do other more useful things, right? We said that they had to target Republicans who were already going to vote for you in the major elections anyway, right? Because they cared about things like abortion and immigration and inflation. And obviously, if Trump or DeSantis was the leader, it didn't matter. They were always going to vote Republican. Instead, we would just do campaigning that targets people on the margins, that convinces people that they need to vote Republican in order to fix the cost of living crisis, that they need to vote Republican in order to protect their borders for immigration, if that was not enough to convince them to vote in the status quo, which simply meant that we just got more Republican voters, which was upstream of all their analysis, right? Because that means you get more voters in the House as well. That means you get more voters in the Senate as well. And that was very simply why they did not actually have an imperative in the debate and why it was just a waste of time. That being said, I'm first going to deal with why the party looks bad, then I'm going to deal with the presidential election, then I'm going to deal with other elections and the fallout. Firstly, on why the party looks bad, immediately. We gave you a bunch of analysis about why infighting in the party was particularly harmful. That was because, one, even if Trump wins, you then make him less popular. So you've brought up a bunch of shit he did. Insofar it is marginal. Note that they rely on marginal dirt being brought up on Trump to get any of their benefits. We also said that insofar as Trump loses, he was more likely to have done things like antagonize a current political leader, which also would have reduced their overall standing and make people less likely to vote for them. But just generally, we said that you lose your gubernatorial authority, right? If the alternative is that Ron DeSantis was going to win, and they give you great analysis to think that Ron DeSantis was going to win, he was running on the fact that he was a good governor. But now the Republican Party looks like they can't even govern themselves. They look like they're completely unstable and they're completely unable to run a body of government effectively, which is exactly why people would not trust them to run the presidency or to run the House or to run the Senate, because you look incompetent. Their only response was like, well, there's always division in the primaries. But panel, if the primaries are something where there's division and your party looks bad, don't draw attention to it. Don't give the media a story because for the first time in history, the Republican Party is throwing shit at one of their own candidates. That's newsworthy. That's why you get more coverage on the Republican primaries. And that's why all the kind of dirt that they say will exist in the status quo actually gets brought up to the fore and can now be capitalized on by the Democrats and by opposition to the Republican Party, which is why it was so dumb to make the primaries a big thing. And we did, in fact, want to hide it. What did they say, though? They said that Trump was a threat to the Republican Party's ability to run in other states. Firstly, they gave you no mechanisms other than why Republicans hate him as to why he's bad. But note, all of their analysis relies on you believing that there is a set of people who are avowedly anti-Trump. One, I think this group is incredibly small. But two, note that for this mech to work, that group must also not be anti-Republican Party. Because if that was the case, if they hated Trump because of his stance on abortion or immigration, when Trump disappears, they still hate the Republican Party. They still vote against the Republican Party. That means their only scale of benefit were people that hated Trump who were okay with the Republican Party. We said that this group of people simply did not matter because they were so small. And what was far more important was Republican voters, the people that Trump could use his charisma to activate and to encouraged to actually come out to elections. Because obviously, if you were engaged enough in politics to be scared of Trump and to form such a hatred for an individual, you probably hated the Republican Party enough anyway. You probably had enough information about your voter preferences that his presence was never going to change you, which meant this scope of change was simply like incredibly small. Finally, though, their mechanism on voter loyalty was the exact reason they would never oppose Trump, because you need to have your party appear to support its own. You need to appear to have trust and coherence in the party, which is why it's so bad. Okay, next thing I'm going to deal with is why it is like so actually, in fact, better to win the presidential election and why Trump will be fine for that aims. First thing that we flag at the start of Alex's speech, certainty is better than uncertainty. You don't know if there'll be a new issue or a new crisis, which simply means that the Republican Party is more or less likely to lose in the future. You should always prefer the election that is happening right now on the margins. Why do they say that the House elections are more important? They say that one, you can leverage it for policy, but two, it gives you power. It gives you power over investigations. Obviously, this relies on you but not believing our analysis as to why the Republican Party ad hominem simply becomes less popular. But conversely, I think that winning the presidential election is in fact far more important for the simple reason that the president has far more power in America. Because you have things like the filibuster, and you have things like the general revealed preference of Senate and houses just to not enact policy. That is the very reason that abortion was enshrined in the courts, because the government was simply too scared to enact on it. Which is why when you have a president, they can do things like enact executive orders. They can do things like signal your policy stance on the international stage, but they can do things like control the messaging of the government and the way that people think about issues, because they have so many more channels to access the people, is in fact so much more powerful than the House, that you are maybe going to lose when the next midterms rolled around because inflation stopped being an issue and the Republican Party fell back out of favor, which is why we would in fact prefer that you won the presidential election. And note, they say that you're going to lose. Their case is that they will lose the presidential election. Panel, that was insane. Even if you did not believe any of our analysis as to why this nuked the Republican Party's power overall, you should always take the certain option of winning the presidency right now. Finally, though, on their material about why Trump is going to be bad when he's a president and comparing that to material about why Trump's backlash is going to be so bad, they say that Trump opposes expectations of the Republican Party. One, their own analysis undermines it insofar as they prove pretty comprehensively why Trump is never going to win the midterm in the status quo. But secondly, we would just say that people are extremely short-termist, right? People are already forgetting about what Trump did when he was in power. And maybe it is true that when Trump is in power, you become slightly less popular in the midterms, even though they have not actually proved why Trump is going to be so anti-Republican interest. But the scale of this harm was incredibly small, right? Because when the next election rolled around in 4 years, people were going to have moved on. There was going to be new news cycles. They were going to be thinking about new things. And the scale of their harm to go into the future was far smaller. Conversely, we got a Trump who was pissed at you. We got a Trump who would mobilize Fox News against the Republican Party, as he had done time and time again, which reduced the extent to which Republicans would vote for you. Panel, you should never make your government look like they were infighting, look like they could not govern at all. That was the worst way to win an election.
Thanks, Deputy Leader of Opposition, for that wonderful speech. And now welcome the final substantive speaker of the government bench to finish off the substantive portion of Ateneo's case. That's Kyle. Here.
Hi, I presume I'm audible and visible. Great. Okay. All right. So if at any point in time I cut out, just let me know. I'll begin my speech. In 3, 2, 1. Second affirmative is right. This debate is about the margins, and thus we will prove to you why the extent to which voters vote are marginally better off the point to which you support other GOP candidates, maybe Mike Pence, Ted Cruz or even Ron DeSantis. We have two primary win conditions in affirmative. The first, why is winning the House or other members or other branches of Congress the best possible way to go for the Republican Party? This will deal with Neg's primary win condition, why even winning, if they win the executive branch, why it is far worse off for them to win the executive, the point which they do so. But second, why we get to unite the party overall, which also responds to Neg's best win condition, which is why they unite the party overall. This will deal with both independent win conditions of negative, and they prove to you why, even in the case that they do win, why they are still far worse off for the long-term success of the party overall. The first thing I want to deal with is the reframing of the counterprop that we got coming from second affirmative and also conversely from the entire affirmative branch. Because the primary claim that they have is that Trump is charismatic and therefore because it looks bad for knifing, because Trump can unite the margins altogether, it is far, far worse off. There are a couple of structural responses we gave to you earlier as well, which I'll integrate here. The first is that this was largely true 6 years ago, but they have no justification as to why this is the likely trend to occur right now. In fact, we told you the opposite because of multiple real-life reasons which currently occur, e.g. the COVID-19 response, the Capitol Hill storming, the broken promises that Trump had towards the same marginal individuals he tried to protect, like the Mexican Wall, for example, giving free healthcare to other individuals, for instance. This necessarily means that even if Trump is able to retain some hardcore supporters, the vast majority of the Republican Party that the negative bench claims that he's still able to protect is far more disillusioned with Trump's rhetoric. But the second claim here is that we would claim knifing is far worse of a negative, since the Democrats can mudsling the GOP more, that the entire GOP is bad because Trump is their bannerman. What this necessarily means is that the center-right individuals, mostly the swing individuals who voted for the Democrats in the 2020 elections for Biden, for example, are still more likely to vote for them under their side of the House, point at which the entire Democratic Party can systematically break down the GOP just because Trump is the bannerman. Note that under both sides of the House, some level of mudslinging will occur. That's the trade-off. The difference is the extent to which that mudslinging occurs. We would posit as far worse on their side of negative, the point that you give them more political capital to destroy the rhetoric of the GOP, the point at which the point at which Trump is their bannerman overall, because there's more dirt, there's more shame on him at the end of the day. The impact of this is simple. Trump isn't the golden boy to make them win. Even if he does, we told you that in 2016, there were excruciating special circumstances to which he won, e.g. Cambridge Analytica providing data to voters for him in Facebook, e.g. the Russians hacking Hillary Clinton's emails, able to send out leaks towards Hillary's failures overall. These were special circumstances in which even with these special circumstances, the race was incredibly close. So the point which you remove these special circumstances, Trump is still likely to lose, even if it is close, as we saw in the 2020 elections. But the second thing that they claim, therefore, is that there's a retaliatory campaign by Trump. And this makes the party more chaotic. Number one, we told you this normal in primaries. This happens all the time. Bernie Sanders and the Democratic Party did this as well. We also saw this in the Obama campaign in 2008 and 2012. What this necessarily means is that Trump has nothing to base his campaign upon. Look back at your notes towards Negative's case. They never brought you a single policy as to how Trump will unite the voters based on just his charisma. Like, what will he use as his charisma to be able to unite voters around? What policy, what measures will he specifically do to unite these marginal people that they want to be able to get? Note that even if they do have some policies that they want to claim they're their side of the House, we told you as to why all his broken promises make it so that it's far, far harder for these disillusioned center-right individuals to bite into Trump's rhetoric. So we will concede. Fine, maybe there will always be some hardcore Trump supporters, some hardcore GOP supporters who will never budge. But that exists in both sides of the debate. The question is where we get these swing voters, who is the most essential in the debate, given that they are the ones who gave Biden the win in 2020 against Trump, and they also Negative wants to pit these same people to be used by Trump in 2024. The impact here is simple. Even if they get some voters to sway under their side of the House, it is about extent. The net amount of voters that you get isn't proportional to you getting the margins that you want to get under their side of the House because of the broken promises, because of all of Trump's failures in the past. But why can we win against Trump under our side of the House if we have more dirt in him? Why can we destroy his primary campaign? So yes, maybe the trade-off we'll take is maybe just slightly more chaotic than the Democratic's primary campaign. But this is the trade-off we're going to get, because the point at which we are able to rally around one candidate, maybe Ron DeSantis, maybe Mike Pence, is perfectly fine, because we can then unite in the national elections to go up against the Democratic candidate at the end of the day. This is important because even if our leader or our primary winner under the side of the GOP, under our side side of the house, loses the executive elections, or lose the presidential election on our side of the house, this is still better because we allow other GOP candidates to be able to win Congress. We allow other GOP candidates to win the Senate, for example. The reason why that comparative is much more likely is this. Because if Trump is a bannerman under the side of negative, it is easier for the Democrats to mudsling the entire GOP versus if it is a cleaner candidate who has like less of a dirty track record, who has less of a bad track record, to demonize the entire party because he is under him. That was a crucial analysis that USU never responded to us. It was because of that the point at which that even if you make Trump win, it is far, far harder for other candidates under the GOP to win. That comparative is crucial for two main reasons. A, necessarily because even if you win the presidential election, it is far harder for you to be able to pass policies. And the reason for that is because the legislative body has the ability to be able to veto, has the ability to be able to budget. These are mechanisms we brought to you from first that are generally unresponded to. So yes, maybe as a president, you have the ability to be able to impose certain Republic Acts. Maybe you have the ability to be able to sign certain amendments. You have the ability to be able to elect some Supreme Court justices. But all of these are still vetted by the legislative body. These are still vetted and can be vetoed by the legislative, the point which the Republicans control the House. Or if say Trump wins their case, the Democrats win the House overall. And we think that's a likely scenario because even if Trump wins under their side, that does not assure that other GOP candidates who run under the Republican Party will also win. In fact, the trend has always been reversed. What this necessarily means is in 2018, when Trump was still president, the Democrats won the House. We had huge amounts of minorities, like AOC, for example, win. So it's generally unlikely that even if Trump wins, and they never prove why they'll also win the House under their side of the House, it is unlikely that Trump will be able to retain as much power. And here's the clincher, because even if Trump wins on negative, you make it incredibly hard for the GOP to do anything with their standing members in Congress, because everybody will dirt on them for them supporting Trump in general, even if they internally don't. But number two, it was literally Trump's own presidency that allowed for waste and paved way for impeachment to happen. So we see the point at which that these harms exist. It is far, far harder for Trump to be able to pass anything, even assuming their best case scenario. Then let's deal with the voter-based analysis. Why do we actually win on the margins overall? And why do we actually get change? Because note, this is the spectrum. Far-right supporters, hardcore Trump supporters will always support Trump. It is about the center-right voters who are in the swing, who are necessarily the most important people that we're able to get. If we use the historical voter analysis and trends, why are they far worse off? It was because in 2020, they alienated the center-right and made them swap the Democrats simply because Trump failed on his COVID-19 response, simply because Trump was impeached, simply because he even failed in his basic promise in 2016 to build a wall against Mexico. Their own characterization that these center-right was the swing was necessarily the point at which they lose this debate, because they themselves don't prove why they get to win this very important swing voter base in the center-right. Why does change ultimately happen on our side? Why do we fulfill our win conditions? Number one, we make it easier for voters to vote for the GOP with less mudslinging. Number two, we create far less problems that the Democrats are able to throw to us. But more importantly, we do not make it so that the presidency is shackled by the chains of the Democratic Party. Even if Trump wins, in their best case scenario, we at least have some marginal delta to make policies, to fight for change. Very proud to propose.
Thank you to the government whip for their speech, and now welcome the opposition whip to finish off the substantive portion of this entire debate. Here.
Okay, can I be heard? Awesome. Let's be very clear. Our burden in this debate is not to prove necessarily that Trump is the far and away best candidate. It's to prove that regardless of who wins the primary, whether it's Trump or Pence or DeSantis or Cruz, this strategy is damaging, regardless of who the candidate is, because there are so many unknowns. It's unknown who the other primary candidates are. It's even unknown who the Dem is, because Biden might, die. It's unknown what the issues of the day are. What is certain is that this looks bad for the party. It fractures the party in notable ways, which is why you should care about the harms we prove, because they are the most certain and most clear harms. I'm going to do a number of things in my speech. One, what does the primary look like? Secondly, what does the general look like? And finally, what do the House and Senate elections look like? On the first, there are a couple of things to discuss about the primary. I think the first thing to say is the opposition explains to us that voters have a problem with Trump. They've seen him in office and they don't like how he behaves. The wall didn't work, party allegiance is strong, and even his hardcore voters won't like him. obviously, if all of these things are true and you buy that Trump is really bad, then why do you need to oppose him as the Republican Party and risk party unity and cohesion? Because like DeSantis or Cruz can say those things to the same extent. It is unclear why the Republican Party themselves need to step in. So if you believe that Trump is super damaging, then obviously the RNC can just like not comment at all as the standard, and he will probably still lose if you agree with their analysis, and then you don't have any of the harms that we bring you about party fracturing and party issues. But there are also a number of reasons why Trump is perhaps, a Utah candidate for president, because all of the other candidates that they discuss just have this kind of severe charisma deficit. Like DeSantis is called DeSanctimonious, and all the other Republicans hate Cruz because he's annoying. Pence is boring, and also the Republicans hate him too because they literally some of them wanted him killed on January 6th. Obviously, the other candidates do have issues, and Trump, who may be, a little bit out of control, is definitely charismatic, can definitely give a good speech, and has all of these qualities that allow him to mobilize voters in ways that are particularly useful, particularly when Republican voter turnout is perhaps low. Those are reasons why Trump is actually a good candidate, but even if you buy he's a bad candidate, the primary system still self-corrects him out. Obviously, that means that there is no reason that the Republican Party or the RNC needs to step in. But now, let's look at electoral outcomes in terms of the general election. I want to be so clear. This is unprecedented to do. Like the RNC, the DNC, whoever does not step in and support certain candidates or demonize other candidates until the primary has decided that. And that's why we tell you, you get massive amounts of media attention on this. That's why we tell you, you break the rules of the game fundamentally and change norms fundamentally in such a way you get so much attention, because it looks like you as the RNC have essentially cracked and lost it. It looks like you are so incapable of handling your own party and your own candidates that you have to resort to something that it fundamentally breaks the way that primaries work. Obviously, that looks incredibly bad and incredibly harmful. It makes you look weak, which is bad when you run on a strongman platform. It makes you look like you can't support and agree with your candidates. That is so damaging, right? Because I think what actually creates a loss of faith of the Republican Party is when you knife your own candidates and look fractured and look disunified and look like you're bad at governance. We tell you at Alex, we tell you at Sam that the Republican platform for the vast majority of the elections is the idea that they're good governors, that they're not wishy-washy, that they have strongman tactics, that they're going to, suit up to do things in defense, that they're going to suit up to do things on the economy. If they can't handle their own candidates and run their own primary smoothly, then it seems incredibly unlikely that they're able to do this as well. Obviously, this is the messaging that comes out when you break the rules of the game so fundamentally. The only response we hear from the affirmative team is this idea that the party will reunify for the general. But let me explain to you why parties can usually reunify for the general. Because the reason they can reunify is it's because the candidates that have problems with each other rather than the party having problems with the candidates. Bernie Sanders can apologize and be like, geez, I really don't like Hillary or Biden personally, but I'll sacrifice it for the good of the party. The party can't be like, oh, we don't like Trump, but I guess we'll sacrifice it for the good of the party, even though we tried to prevent him from running for the good of the party. That looks hypocritical. That looks stupid. Secondly, we tell you that this looks so fundamentally stupid and bad that we don't want to draw attention to any division that exists. We say that at Sam to no response. But finally, their analysis is reliant on believing that Trump will bow out really nicely. Like all of the examples that they give about people who like bow out really nicely are Democrats. They're like Bernie. And I think that Trump is such a firecracker and unpredictable in the way that he will probably, if he feels like the election has been fundamentally rigged against him by the party, speak out about that, make the party look worse, make the party look like they're stealing elections. Obviously, that looks really, really bad for the party as well. And the final thing they say is they're like, actually, it's really good if Trump, gets a nomination and it looks really bad and he loses because he's a liability as president. But I think the first thing to say is that he is to some extent memorable because they managed him throughout his 2016 to 2020 term. But also, there are a number of reasons why you want the president on your side. Things like, nominating judges to the Supreme Court, executive orders, confirming heads of departments and nominating heads of departments, government messaging. It's having the president on side isn't just about the president as a person, it's what the powers allow you to do such that you control the whole executive. Obviously, it is incredibly important. And if they stake their case on it being good that Trump loses, you have to buy that all of these things the Republican Party no longer has access to are really good. I think that's something that is incredibly hard to buy. Finally, on electoral outcomes for the House and Senate, I'm going to make a number of claims. I think the first thing to say is that they are not necessarily more important than the presidential. I gave you some reasons, Sam gave you some reasons. Secondly, they tell us that Trump can be mobilized against other Republicans if he's president. I think the first thing to say is that Trump will probably insert himself in Congress elections regardless. He's already been their president. I think the damage is probably done to some extent. Like, he's currently not president, but he inserted himself very viciously in the midterms. Unclear what the marginal difference is. But also, a lot of the issues that they are having in the House and the Senate at the moment isn't about swing voters, it's about their voter turnout. Republican voter turnout from the base is comparatively very low, particularly in the older age groups where they actually need turnout because that's where a lot of their voters. Trump is charismatic such that he is able to mobilize voters and message to them significantly better because he has control of networks like Fox News, because he gives a good speech where other candidates don't. That means Trump probably mobilizes better for the House and Senate. But also, then we tell you that the group that is anti-Trump but not anti-Republican is a tiny group. They say, okay, this is the center-right group, but the center-right group probably care about the policy anyways, right? Because a lot of people who are center-right really care about economic management, something that Biden has been screwing over religiously. They will probably still vote for Republican candidates regardless. The final thing they tell us is, oh, look at 2018, look at 2020. But obviously what that doesn't acknowledge is that there is a structural anti-incumbent bias in the midterms, and that this has been happening for 60, 70 years. They're like, oh no, we'll have another 2018 where we'll lose the House again. That is just structurally likely and nothing to do with Trump. At the end of this speech, what you should believe is that this policy is fundamentally unnecessary and carries sufficient harms such that it is nowhere near worthwhile doing, and that is why we are proud to negate.
Thanks everyone for that excellent substantive portion. We now go to the negative reply. Welcome back, Sam. You here?
Firstly, on what happens in the primaries, because they say that Trump is unpopular and is bad at governing. We simply say that this is already known in the status quo, that DeSantis and Ted Cruz will say this when they step up their campaigns against Trump, that the media has incentives to reveal and remind the populace of all the bad things that Trump does. But because they say that Trump betrayed them, and so people have already felt betrayed, they already remember the ways that Trump stabbed them in the back, if you believe their analysis, which is exactly why you should believe that there is no imperative to stop Trump, because they describe why Trump will never win in the first place. Even if you don't believe that, their only mechanisms are that you're able to dunk on Trump's reputation. If you believe that even a little bit of this information is known about Trump, you should probably believe our analysis on why the main axis for voting in the primaries is going to be on establishment. It'll be Trump versus DeSantis. It'll be establishment versus anti-establishment, which is why even in their best case, the delta of how much you are actually able to swing these primary votes was incredibly small, and their benefits were already tiny. Secondly, on what we would do instead, we gave you the very sensible idea of just campaigning to people who you needed to vote for you in the main elections, that you would activate things like the fear of inflation and fear of immigration, and that you would do the very thing that they said, there was shit on Biden, because you could use all this time and money that you put into advertising to simply do this instead. This was a far more direct path to ensuring that you had more electoral control and that you got all these electoral benefits. But secondly, we said that you would hide the mudslinging, that you would stop the primaries from becoming this massive issue that news channels like CNN locked onto by not doing this thing that was so new and it was so crazy and it was so newsworthy. On weighing then, the benefits I'll describe later for them rely on, one, that you believe that Trump was going to win in the status quo. Two, that they are able to prevent Trump from winning under their side. And thirdly, an additional set of their benefits rely on you believing that Trump will lose the presidential elections, but that the alternative will not lose the presidential elections. Panel, we present a far more easy path to our benefits. We just say that we do more sensible campaigning. We do not make our party look like it is infighting. Then, on why that lets us win short-term elections. Their individual mechanisms already matter far less, because we say that you vote for parties and you vote for policies, which is precisely why Trump is a fine leader, especially if he wins the primary and there's clearly a revealed preference of Republicans to back him. Our mechanisms on stability were far more direct, though, because it meant that your party did not look fit to govern. It meant that the Republican Party had betrayed one of its own, and that was particularly going to be felt by people that wanted Trump to be the primary candidate because the party had actively gone against their Democratic interests. We said, though, that damage was done, that as soon as it was out there, the Democrats were going to lock onto it and we're going to challenge your ability to be fit to govern. We said this was even worse in the case where a leader like Ron DeSantis was in power, because that was his very policy platform, that he was a sensible and reliable governor. What are the impacts of this? We say that we lose Republican voters that you needed to win, and that you could no longer and that you are no longer able to campaign on things like effective governance. But beyond that, they conceded that we lost the presidential elections, which meant that we lost things like executive orders. And importantly, you should believe things like executive orders are more important because we don't rely on an extra step to get it. Their only mechanism for losing the House was that there's a set of anti-Trump voters. We give you so much analysis as to why it is tiny. That is utterly insufficient to lay up against all of the Republican voters who now have been betrayed and do not trust you to govern anymore. Finally, then, on long-term elections, the first thing to note is this clash matters far, far less. Because we flag down the bench that's so much more uncertain, because we also flag that people are simply going to forget about what Trump does when he's in power. So they say that Trump is going to undermine the party, but notably, given no mechanisms as to why he's likely to do this again, conversely, we say that you have undermined the voters, you have betrayed their trust. So, panel, it probably ends up being pretty symmetric. People feel betrayed either way, but importantly, because we give you a far more direct and a far more reliable path to victory to explaining why you win the short-term House and Senate elections. But quite simply, you should not draw attention to embarrassing things about your party. You must vote side affirmative. Negative.
Thanks, Take Reply, and welcome the final speaker of this excellent debate. It's the affirmative reply, Rivaldo.
Am I audible? All right. My speech in 3, 2, 1. There's an independent reason why they lose this debate. It's because their arguments are so disillusioned from reality. No matter how much we call it out, they won't listen. They say a lot of anecdotal claims, or perhaps structural at best, to prove their arguments. But we support all of ours with empirical evidence, aka facts, to prove that if both logical reasons are potentially true, you need to believe facts over them. Why? Because this debate is ultimately about electoral interests. And logic in the debate doesn't matter if voters do not follow this logic. We tell you that, for example, it's a fact that primaries do not affect unity later on. Voters, supposedly by your logic, will listen to the media who calls this out as a sign of weakness. But the reason why this doesn't matter is, firstly, empirical evidence proves that if in the past, no matter how much mudslinging there was, and no matter how much Trump made fun of Biden fighting Bernie and all of those things, which he did, at the end, ultimately, it is still not enough because people will still care more and weigh heavier what we told you that what we weighed is more important, which is ultimately the policy decisions, right? Second, the fact that voters can just be rational, right? Like, you haven't proven that voters will follow this carefully curated knowledge that you talked about, right? We tell you that it's just a fact that people are still following Trump. You say that if he's bad already, then obviously people will not vote for him. But no, he still has voter support for whatever reason. Maybe it's because of his charisma, but that in itself is proof and a contradiction that proves that the GOP needs to do everything that they can to curtail his power. Why can't they win this debate on rules of debate? There's a massive contradiction between the strategies of their first negative and the rest of the debate, right? There's a big pivot. They say that, oh, Trump is a good candidate to have because he has a lot of unique selling points, his racist rhetoric, his ability to unite and be a strong man, right? When second leg pivots away from this and says, it doesn't matter what candidate wins, you have to throw out that in because you don't have a lot of those unique selling points and it's not assured. But if what you're trying to say is, oh, it's just better in any outcome because a Trump win is good and anyone else winning is good, let's destroy both of these win conditions and both of the scenarios, right? Firstly, they say if someone else wins the election, right? They have never proved the likelihood of this. We've constantly disputed it. We said that Trump will win the primary, because it's just the fact that Trump has too many voters to the detriment of the party. We told you that it's because of the silence of the GOP that we will replicate the situations and the criteria in 2016 in which the Republicans just supported him. And that's why they can't make this claim that, oh, no, there is no delta on the debate and we can get all of your benefits. Absolutely not. Because non-action and passively supporting him by not talking about these things will result in the overly powerful strongman politics that made it such that Trump was a bad Republican candidate. And this is where we really shit on the debate, right? Because if they're okay, even in the worst case, with Trump being a candidate and winning, that itself is debate losing. Because they never really tell us, why is it so good if Trump wins anyway, right? They said the only reason why this is good is because the president is so powerful. Firstly, we have won the debate as to why the presidency is weaker than the House. Sure, you can deadlock the reasons, such as how legislation makes policies and the president has veto power or the president has executive orders, right? We tell you this is a deadlock because legislation has to create all of these or approve these policies anyways. So what wins us that debate? We said the House sets the budget. They can investigate and impeach him and destroy his credibility and remove all of your benefits, right? And that is why you are particularly strong on our side, right? That is where they need to talk about political pendulum. If they say and concede anti-incumbent bias, exactly. That means if Trump wins the presidency, then that is what hurts the chances of winning the House in the halftime election, right? 2026 election, right? It's the fact that you are going to have a constant punching bag for House candidates to be able to rally against, and that's why you're going to have a majority Democratic seats, which is the worst thing that can happen, right? Panel, we have been the side that has been more logical to reality or true to reality. But more importantly, we have won on all conditions. But most importantly, we've proven the likelihood that our frame needs to be believed, so that you shouldn't even consider their even ifs because they haven't proven that you can even arrive at those impacts. We must win.
Thanks, Reply. Thanks, everyone. Great debate. What I'll get you guys to do now is to leave the room, and we will call you back in the main room and on Discord once our deliberation is complete. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for the debate,
Thanks for the debate, everyone.
Was the deliberation be recorded as well?
What was that? Sorry?
Would the deliberation be recorded as well?
No, of course not. Let's